Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I'm Deepak, your host from India. We are honored to welcome Dr. Manashi Ray as our distinguished guest on Business Talk today. Before we get started, I would like to introduce the guest for today's episode. Borders Dr. Manashi Ray believes are as much social concerns as they are geographic ones, and her life's work is dedicated to understanding how people navigate, translate, and are shaped by them. As a professor of sociology at West Virginia State University, Dr. Manushi sits at a compelling crossroads where global migration meets personal identity, where policy shapes lives, and where technology is quietly redrawing the map of human belonging. Drawing on foundational frameworks, Dr. Pierre Bourdieu's theory of capital, transnational network analysis, and life course perspectives, she investigates why people move, what they carry with them, and how they build their worlds on the other side. Her research casts a wide net. She explores the migratory journeys of South and East Asian refugee populations through a deliberate gender lens, uncovering how women's experiences of displacement and settlement are often rendered invisible in mainstream migration narratives. Her scholarly work has appeared in leading journals, including the Journal of Ethics and Migration Studies, Development, Economic and Political Weekly, and the Asia and Pacific Migration Journal, alongside book chapters with reputed international publishers. Her most ambitious project to date, a book titled Becoming Boundless, Indian Transnational Entrepreneurs in the Global Economy, captures the spirit of a new generation of globally mobile professionals who are redefining what it means to belong to a place. Beyond her research, Professor Manushi Ray is a committed institutional citizen. She holds the position of Treasurer for RC31 Sociology of Migration 2023-07 within the International Sociological Association and is an active contributor to the American Sociological Association and Sociologists for Women in Society. In the classroom, she brings the same intellectual rigor to courses on social inequality, international migration, gender family, and community organization, mentoring students and championing their voices at local scholarly conferences. Professor Ray's sociology is not merely an academic pursuit. It is a tool for making the invisible visible. In today's episode, we sit down with Professor Manashi Ray to unpack the bold ideas at the heart of her recent book, Becoming Boundless, Indian Transnational Entrepreneurs in the Global Economy, published by Stanford University Press. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Manashi Ray to the conversation. Professor Manashi, thank you so much for thoughtful gesture of sending me your book. I truly admire your kindness and generosity. I would also like to extend my gratitude to Stanford University Press for their prompt and seamless delivery. It is a distinct privilege to welcome you to Business Talk.
Hello. Hi, Deepak. Thank you for the invitation and for your generosity to feature me in your podcast. Okay.
So, Professor, your book repositions Indian transnational entrepreneurs as active architects of a multipolar world order, not just economic migrants chasing opportunity. How did your fieldwork challenge or confirm that bold claim?
So, in my fieldwork for the book project, I interviewed 60 men and women transnational entrepreneurs, whom I shall hereon address as TEs, who operated across multiple national contexts that spanned India, North America, Europe, and many other regions. They were not merely adapting to a global economy designed by superpowers. They were constructing new transnational spaces of exchange, and through their transnational business and investments, they connected emerging markets with established centers of capital and innovation in the US and India, thereby contributing to a diffusion of economic influences beyond the traditional Western hubs. At the same time, the data also challenged an overly celebratory view of transnational entrepreneurship. The TE's actions and practices were informed and shaped by unequal structures of caste affiliation, class and gender hierarchies, and prevalent immigration policies in both countries. So what emerged was a more nuanced picture. Indian transnational entrepreneurs are indeed active architects of an increasingly multipolar world order, but their agency is exercised within and often reproduces existing inequalities. Now, I must mention here at the very onset that the data for the book was collected in the period of 2007 and 18. And so it was just before the onset of COVID, when the world was a very different place from what it is today. So these TEs were intensely drawn to entrepreneurship at the height of globalization, which enabled a rapid growth of transnational interactions, particularly between India and the United States. The book, therefore, argues that migration to advanced countries calls for a greater understanding, moving beyond the image of an Indian migrant simply crossing the border in search of opportunities or security and settling down in the host country. The 60 respondents, TEs, irrespective of their skill levels, were crossing, connecting, and transforming borders, helping to shape new centers that linked India to the wider world in professional services and manufacturing sectors.
Professor, migration is often celebrated as a great equalizer, but you argue that transnational spaces can actually reproduce caste and class hierarchies. Can you walk us through a moment from your research that made the tension viscerally real for you?
One of the most important lessons from my fieldwork was dismantling the myth that migration was a great equalizer. Simply because migrants cross national borders with often carry their own old inequalities into new settings. And sometimes the reproduction of the inequalities is in very subtle and unexpected ways. What made this tension particularly real for me was observing how entrepreneurial networks were formed and sustained for a long periods of time. In my interviews with the TEs, I noted these men and women gained access to business opportunities, investment capital, partnership and mentorship, very often from pre-existing global networks, rooted in educational institutions like IIT and other regional engineering colleges, caste and family connections, class privileges, and often working in the same multinationals. It can lived in India and then moved abroad in the same multinational. I highlight, therefore, in my book, many of the TEs nourished strong and weak ties within the network that facilitated business success and which were actually built on pre-migratory cultural resources, which were later consolidated and revalorized in the United States, either by getting a graduate education or by work experience. Second was that I often observed TEs described their achievement as products of individual talent, hard work, risk-taking, and yet their trajectories were deeply shaped by networks that were not equally available to everyone. Elite educational credentials, class and family business backgrounds, and inherited social connections frequently open doors to opportunities that appeared on the surface to be purely meritocratic. I will quote to bring this point home, I will quote something that was shared, and it's in the book by a TE in Silicon Valley. My involvement with IIT Network is to take this critical mass of excellence to another level. By coming together, we are and can be a formidable force for global entrepreneurship. What brings us together is the camaraderie, the common experience of being together from age 17 or 18 for the next 5 years in IIT as batchmates, hostel/roommates, branch mates, or campus mates. Thus, without such advantage, often TEs who did not have this advantage often faced significantly greater barrier entering the same transnational circuits. Therefore, the BRIC brings out the coexistence of mobilities and inequality. Migration has undeniably expanded horizons and created new possibilities for Indian migrants, but access to those possibilities are uneven and dependent on their human, cultural, and social capital. The transnational arena is not a level playing field.
Professor, you specifically examine women entrepreneurs navigating industries where they are structurally disadvantaged. What strategies did these women deploy, and did migration genuinely expand their agency, or did it simply relocate the ceiling?
Yeah. The women transnational entrepreneurs were the most interesting subgroup in this whole 60 respondents. And I feel that it is a unique contribution as a chapter in the book. The women TEs were not passive recipients of globalization's benefit. They were highly strategic actors who constantly negotiated gender expectations across multiple social and cultural contexts. Their success was influenced by a variety of forms of heterogeneity that intersect in transnational space. Women TEs deployed a variety of strategies to establish legitimacy and authority in professional services and manufacturing sectors. In knowledge-based economies, women TEs leverage their educational credentials, professional expertise, cultural capital like English language proficiency, and access to spousal and trade networks to get global clients and cross-border business opportunities. While some other, particularly so in the manufacturing sectors like real estate, logistic, and cargo transfer, strategically mobilized family and community ties, transforming relationships that are often viewed as constraints in androcentric sectors into sources of business support, capital, and market access. Several of them spoke about the need to prove their competence repeatedly in ways that their male counterpart did not have to do so. Their entrepreneurial success often depended not only on business acumen, but also on their ability to manage and negotiate competing social expectations. As this quote, again, to highlight what kind of challenges they faced, I quote from a woman transnational entrepreneur in the manufacturing sector. To be precise, she was in the logistic and cargo transfer. In my sector in India, women are constantly reminded that they are imperfect in a million ways. Unlike my non-Indian or European colleagues, no matter what I do, it was not enough. It is not a zero-sum game. In the past, if I asked for an advice or counsel, I was repeatedly put on the wrong path. In the custom house, if I was to make a judgment call or a business decision, it was not respected. The men derided my action behind my back. It was very difficult to break into men's inner circle. Often I did not know whether they were patronizing me or they were giving me the due respect. You cannot let them see as weak and angry. You develop a persona of an alpha woman that no matter what comes your way, you understand the issue and you are able to handle it. So my research with women TEs highlight that migration did expand their women's agency, but not in a linear or a uniform way. Crossing borders often opened access to new educational opportunities, professional networks, sources of capital, and institutional environment that were supportive of women's entrepreneurial ambition. So the ceiling caused by structural barriers like immigration status, gender and caste membership, geographical location, and religious affiliation did not simply vanish, but in numerous ways it moved, shaped, changed shape, and became less visible. Women TE's agency stemmed not from the absence of structure, but from the capacity to act creatively and effectively to resist the structural challenges and powers.
Professor, your research spans a defining 10-year window in India's economic liberalization. How did policy shift on both sides, India and US, shape the opportunities and vulnerabilities of the entrepreneurs you studied?
See, this was a moment in time in India's and American history. So, this 10-year period covered in the book was especially significant because it coincided with profound transformation in India. It was as if all the stars had aligned in the histories of two countries in the global environment, favorable for cross-border trade and investment. From T's trajectories, from repeatedly hearing in the interviews, the recorded interviews of experiences, it became clear to me that the individual ambition or the business acumen was just not enough. It was deeply shaped by the macro policy environment of both in India and the United States. Economic liberalization, which started in 1991 in India, expanded the opportunities by reducing regulatory barriers, encouraging private enterprise, integrating India more deeply into global markets, and creating new sectors for investment and innovation. These reforms opened spaces for entrepreneurs to build businesses that connected India to the global force of capital, technology, knowledge, and labor. On the US side, immigration policies favoring the migration of the highly skilled, H-1B visa regime, the new liberal economic policies, the technology boom of 1990s played an unequal but important role in motivating the best and the brightest from India to migrate to the United States. Many entrepreneurs initially entered through educational and professional pathways that allowed them to acquire the skills, build networks, and access global market. All these factors together facilitated the circulation of talent, knowledge that made transnational entrepreneurship possible. So, despite entrepreneurs despite entrepreneurs were highly agentic force actors, their opportunities were neither entirely self-made nor entirely determined by the market. Transnational entrepreneurship emerged because the states, both the states, United States as America as well as India, were enablers for such a phenomenon to happen. This insight is important because it challenges the popular image that entrepreneurs as an autonomous market actor. Their stories actually reveal how states continue to matter in eras often described as borderless, even if entrepreneurs themselves work across and beyond national boundaries.
Professor, the people in your book straddle two worlds simultaneously. Did you find that their Indian identity became a resource, something leveraged strategically, or was it more of a negotiated burden in Western business environments?
That's a good question. That's a really good question. One of the most fascinating aspects of the research was that Indian identity was rarely experienced as purely an asset or as purely a burden. Identity is something that was actively negotiated and strategically mobilized rather than simply inherited. For many entrepreneurs, their Indian identity became a valuable source for transnational capital. As India's economic prominence increased in the global arena, and during the period I studied, many TEs were able to position themselves as a bridge between India and the West, or as a bridge between India and United States, using their Indian identity, right? Their familiarity with both contexts, therefore, enabled them to connect investors, firms, professionals, and markets in ways others could not. In this sense, the Indian identity often became a competitive advantage and a source for entrepreneurial opportunity. But on the flip side, women entrepreneurs in particularly often had to navigate not only their gendered expectations, but also assumptions associated with their ethnicity, that is, as an Indian woman, and their immigration status, if they had migrated to United States as a tied migrant, on a spousal visa. So in these situations, identity could create additional hurdles that required careful management and strategic self-presentation. So to me, it was striking to see how fluidly how many entrepreneurs moved between these different dimensions of identity. They emphasized their Indian background when it enhanced their credibility, market access, or trust, while at other times they foregrounded more cosmopolitan and a global identity. So they were neither abandoning their Indianness nor simply preserving it unchanged. They were continuously redefining what it meant to be an Indian in a transnational context. Ultimately, I would say the entrepreneurs in the book occupied a space between worlds. The Indian identity was often a source of opportunity, credibility, and connection, but it could also expose them sometimes to exclusion and stereotyping in certain circumstances. So entrepreneurs continuously negotiated its meaning and value across different transnational settings.
Professor, ethnographic and archival research over a decade is an enormous commitment. What did you see or hear in the field that no survey or dataset could have ever captured?
Okay. So one of the greatest strengths of ethnographic and archival research is its ability to reveal the lived experiences, meanings, and contradictions that often remain invisible in surveys, statistical data set, or at macro level analysis. While quantitative data can tell you who migrated, who started the business, how many men started, how many women started the business, so on and so forth, and how much capital is moved across borders, it cannot easily capture how people understand their own journeys, navigate uncertainties, build trust, or make sense at a very intimate level what success means, what failures mean, how family disintegrate, or how family rallies around, so on and so forth. So in my fieldwork, I observed TEs would be in constant negotiations and renegotiations. Entrepreneurs were not simply economic actors responding to market incentives. They were individuals simultaneously managing family obligations as a son, taking care of his old parents, cultural expectations. If you are a high caste member, what does your caste ask of you? Immigration constraints, business risks, and transnational identities. In my interviews and participant observations, because I spent lengthy periods of time, sometimes living in the entrepreneur's house, in the factory floors to see what they were doing, I saw that they were deeply embedded in social relationships, emotions, moral commitments, and historical experiences, which only ethnographic research could capture. This would never have been possible in a survey. The complexities rarely appear in data sets because they emerge through stories that people tell you and interactions and reflections rather than in measurable variables. Finally, I would say that my ethnographic approach made it possible to see globalization not as an abstract economic process, but something that was lived and contested and experienced in everyday life.
Professor, one of your most provocative questions is whether migration transforms inequality or simply relocates it. After a decade of research, where do you personally land on that question?
Personally, I would say that migration does both. It transforms inequality and relocates it. I came away from the research convinced that migration is one of the most powerful mechanisms for social transformation in our contemporary world. But its transformative potential is always mediated by existing structures of power. Therefore, the question becomes is not whether migration eliminates inequality. Rather, it is how migration reshapes inequality, who benefits from those transformations, who remains excluded, and what are the new forms of hierarchy which is emerging in this process. Yeah, so that would be that's how finally I concluded my study. That is what I felt.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. If policymakers in India and US read Becoming Boundless Tomorrow. What is the single insight you would most them want to read and act on? And what are they most likely getting wrong right now?
Um, well, what policymakers are most likely to get wrong is the tendency to view migration and entrepreneurship through a narrow national lenses. Too often, migrants are categorized either as skilled workers, highly skilled, low skilled, semi skilled, whatever, filling labor shortages, or investors who are bringing capital, or, if it is lowly skilled worker, then seeking opportunities. My research shows that transnational entrepreneurs occupy a much more complex position. That is the first thing that often a policymaker thinks only at the national level, only in the national context, I mean. For Indian policymakers, the lesson is that engagement with the diaspora should extend beyond remittances and investment flows. The diaspora, also, which is Indian diaspora, is the biggest in the world now, as of today. The diaspora represents a reservoir of knowledge, expertise, institutional linkages, and global networks that can contribute to economic development, technological advancement, and global influence. So both America and India have to figure out which state and national policies would can enhance transnational entrepreneurship and make this possible in the current world order, which has become which is not as it used to be at the height of globalization, where nowadays we see almost all nation states world over have turned inward post-COVID and after the new Trump government in the US. But yet there are many scopes and as India is signing more and more of many bilateral treaties, there is scope, and I am hopeful that transnational entrepreneurship will continue, will thrive, and in many new sectors and with many newer countries. It may not be just, my study is limited to United States and India, but going forward, I see the transnational entrepreneurs, Indian transnational entrepreneurs will connect with, say, France, with UK, with, of course, I have not studied, but India has a lot of trading relations with the Arab countries, with UAE. So, yeah, I am very optimistic that this trend will continue, but maybe in a different shape and form, and in newer sectors and with different countries.
Professor Manashi Ray, thank you so much for such a rich and thought-provoking conversation. Becoming
I would
Boundless is one of those rare books that doesn't just explain migration, it fundamentally changes how you see the people, networks, and inequalities that shape our global economy. For our listeners, whether you are an entrepreneur, a researcher, or simply someone curious about how the world is being quietly remade by those who dare to cross borders, this book is essentially ready. You can find Becoming Boundless Indian Transnational Entrepreneurs in the Global Economy, published by Stanford University Press at Stanford University Press website. Thank you for joining us today on Business Talk, and we look forward to seeing you in our next episode. Thank you so much, Professor Ray, for joining us on Business Talk and sharing such deep, illuminating insights on your remarkable work. Thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing, for allowing me to share some of my thoughts from the book and with your audience. And I hope you will continue doing this phenomenal work and making so much knowledge available to a wider public. Many of us, I have gone through many of your podcasts, many of us work, but our work remains in silos. So I would say that you are actually doing a great service to public sociology, that you are actually bringing the thoughts which from the from the scholars who are serious scholars who are doing this, doing research to the public. It's incredible work, and I am thankful to you.